This is an important forum, as I mentioned. I particularly want to thank the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association, the Institute for Competitiveness and Sustainable Economy, the Center for New Economy, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, the Smart Electric Power Alliance, and the Combined Heat and Power Association for their roles in serving as sponsors of today's important event. I also want to thank each of you for joining us. We have a full room today. The electricity system in Puerto Rico has been in the news in good ways, and frankly, much more in bad ways because it's a failed system today. And our discussion today will be, how do we get the lights back on, and how do we do it in the right way? I want to ask Josen Rossi, who is a past president of the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association, to come up to make some remarks and introduce our first speaker this morning. By background, Josen Rossi is past president of the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association. He's a businessman. He's a respected energy expert and someone who every day is working in his leadership role of chairman of ICSE in order to bring about a better electricity system in Puerto Rico. So let's give a welcome to Josen Rossi.
Thanks, Jerry. Good morning. Good to see old friends from Puerto Rico here in Washington, D.C. with us here today. I have three important messages that have to do with our objective here today. Number one, I'm proud to represent the will, the commitment, the monies of the private sector that have been put in place for years now so that we better the governance, the planning, and the execution of our electrical system. Obviously, we've not had much success to date, okay? But that doesn't mean important battles have been fought. We have to thank Centro Nueva Economía, funded by private sector Puerto Rico, so that we do have a strong, modern, regulatory framework legally in place prior to PROMESA, prior to Puerto Rico government bankruptcy that we can build on. Number two, we have to thank Industriales, the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association. It's their monies and their commitment to lobbying for the good of all sectors Puerto Rico, all consumers, so that we have a chance with PROMESA law and some of its existing language to enact change now without changing neither PROMESA law nor Puerto Rico laws in any significant manner. But we're also here today to thank some of the partners of the Institute that, along with that commitment and money and willingness, Puerto Rico private sector have been intervening, both Puerto Rico Energy Commission, at times Puerto Rico government, and our fiscal board now, so that they see the light in not just turning the lights back on quickly now, but also maintaining them sustainably with what now everybody understands will require a redesign of the grid. So again, I would encourage you to understand that we have great challenges in place right now. There's capital and there's private financing available at many levels, both residential, small businesses, big industry, that are waiting for a little bit of nudging on the rulemaking to start enacting change now. I hope that's part of the discussion today. We don't have to wait for a big redesign. On the other hand, if we don't redesign right, we will be wasting a tremendous opportunity. So nobody better to get us started on the subject than Professor Scott Hempling. He understands Puerto Rico regulations since they started barely 3 years ago in our territory, thanks to having that new legal framework. And I'm glad that you're here, Dr. Hempling, and can get us kicked off.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay in the back? And I had a handout. You may have to share. Who does not have a copy of my handout? Could you just raise your hand? Can we get some of the people who have adjacent copies and pass them over to the ones with the bad luck? I'm an advisor to the Puerto Rico Electric Commission. which was created after 70 years of no regulation of a vertically integrated government-owned monopoly. Again, 70 years of no regulation of a government-owned monopoly. We have started to create a regulatory infrastructure from scratch, and now its strength and necessity are going to be tested. The conversation I want to have, I'm going to take about 15 minutes to speak and then take 5 minutes of questions. First, I want to make sure we're all clear on the principles of economic regulation, because without those principles, there's going to be economic waste. Secondly, I want to make sure you understand the legal foundations under which the Regulatory Commission acts. We have all the authority we need right now, assuming it's not preempted by federal law, to straighten the situation out, to attract the capital, to protect the consumers, and to empower the consumers to act in the most efficient possible way. Thirdly, I want to describe to you the obstacles and uncertainties that face the regulatory system that the 2014 statute created, because without an understanding of those obstacles and uncertainties, you could underestimate the task that the Commission has before it. And lastly, I want to end on a positive note by describing some of the next steps that I think are essential to put the regulatory system in place, have it be accepted by all parties, so that money can flow in the direction that it needs to flow. So let me start with some very basic points. These are the principles that animate our Commission and that animate the very purpose of regulation. People who spend a career in regulation think that the purpose of regulation is recovering costs for the monopoly. It's not. The purpose of regulation is performance. The purpose of regulation is to produce results that are comparable to what effective competition would produce. And that purpose is the same whether we're regulating monopoly markets or whether we're trying to introduce competitive markets. And our Commission is responsible for doing both. What do we do when we want to induce performance? Commissions set standards. They assign consequences for failing to meet those standards or for meeting and exceeding those standards. By taking those steps, we achieve the purpose of regulation, which is to align self-interest with the public interest. That's why you have speed limits. That's why you have traffic lights, to align private behavior with the public interest. That's why we have a Commission. That's why the 2014 Act was enacted. Now, what do effective regulators do at a time like this? What do they do continuously? They envision the products and services that best serve the customers. They then design and oversee the market structures that are most likely to produce that mix of products and services. Vision without action is useless. So it's the Commission's job to create a vision and then to implement it. And that is what we expect to do over the coming months and years. Another principle, economic efficiency comes first. It's better to spend time getting the pie big and then fighting over who gets what share than to fight over whether there's going to be a pie and end up with no pie at all. So economic efficiency comes first. It means we allocate costs to people who cause them. It means we allocate rewards to people who earn them. It means that politics doesn't determine the allocation of wealth. It means that merits determine the allocation of wealth. That's the same for regulation and for competition. Rewards and penalties must be based on merit, not on incumbency, not on political connections. Merit. And that's the job of the Commission, to determine merit. Thirdly, competition and privatization are not religions. Do I need to repeat that? Competition and privatization are not religions. Religion is based on beliefs and prayers. Competition is a market structure. A market structure is effectively competitive when it has many viable suppliers, many educated consumers, low barriers to entry. Competition is a market structure that, after taking 70 years of monopoly power, will take time and effort to introduce. Privatization is not a religion. It's a form of ownership that, like all forms, has benefits and detriments. And the Commission and people involved in this restructuring will be looking at privatization as well as government ownership. Thirdly, competition and regulation are not in conflict. That's a myth. The best sentence I've ever read in my 33 years in the business was written by Alfred Kahn in his great treatise, The Economics of Regulation, where he says it is the job, the continuing job, of legislators and regulators to find the best possible mix of inevitably imperfect regulation and inevitably imperfect competition. It's the best possible mix. It's not one versus the other. The two can be accommodated in any market sector that we set up. Together, what do competition and regulation do? They induce accountability. Accountability to consumers, to investors, and to the public. That's what I want to make sure we understand for that principle. Another principle, consumers are actors. They're not just victims. I keep hearing that we need to, quote, protect the consumer. I even heard that in the discussions over whether we should introduce competition, as if competition was something bad for consumers from which we have to protect them. Consumers are actors. They cause demand. Demand causes costs. Costs have to be paid for. So part of a regulatory system is to help consumers behave in the most efficient, ethical, legal, possibly way. That's what we mean by consumers being actors, not just victims. Now, when regulators make decisions, the next principle, what matters most are the facts. I spend a lot of time in regulation, and it's not just about Russia investigations where there are fake facts. There are plenty of CEOs and consumer advocates who walk in with adjectives and adverbs rather than facts and logic. And our commission is focused on facts and logic. That's the basis for our decisions. Now, facts change. Economies of scale change because other things change. Cost structure changes. Technology changes. Customer preferences change. Production processes change. So effective regulation is all about accommodating those changes by recognizing them as facts that have to be addressed in the regulatory process. Second to last principle, the regulatory agency, if it's going to be effective, has to be expert and it has to be independent. A commission is not a supermarket. It's not a place where people shop for favors. It's an expert agency that makes decisions, as I said, based on facts and on logic. And to make those decisions, we need the expertise and the experience and the resources to acquire the facts, apply logic, and get the answers. We're not a supermarket. Let me turn to the second major area, and that is to make sure you all understand the regulatory framework put in place by the legislature in 2014. Again, this replaces a regime that for 70 years was a vertically integrated monopoly, free of competition, government-controlled. The main language that I've quoted here gives you a sense of the breadth and the depth of the Commission's authority. First, the Commission shall be an independent government entity in charge of regulating, overseeing, and ensuring compliance with the public policy on energy of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. You know, I got the news this morning that the FOMB, the Federal Oversight Management Board, is going to federal court to get approval of its person to oversee PREPA. And in thinking about that, putting aside whether I think it's positive or negative, I personally think it's a positive development, but I don't speak for the Commission. But I was asked, well, what does this mean for the Commission's authority? And I said, I don't care if they put the Pope in charge. Act 57 gives authority to the Commission. Now, we'll find a way to work with FOMB, but PREPA is still PREPA, and PREPA under Act 57 is subject to the authority of the Commission, and none of that changes regardless of who is at the top of the heap at PREPA. So I look forward to working that out. Next, the Energy Commission is the key component for the faithful and transparent execution of energy reform. The Commission shall be able to guarantee the orderly and integrated development of our electrical system, shall evaluate the utility's plans regarding its obligation to efficiently generate power, shall oversee all types of operations, processes, and mandates, shall oversee the debt issues, shall approve the electricity rates, shall require that the prices in any agreement be just and reasonable, etc., shall guarantee that PREPA meets its obligations to bondholders. That's the essence of the Commission's authority. There's another 30 single-spaced pages of detail on it, but that's the basics of it. Let me tell you what we have done with the authority that has been granted to us so far, to make sure you have that background. First, major action that we did was something called the transition charge. This is frequently misunderstood. The bondholders in negotiations with the PREPA under the old government agreed to take a 15% haircut, to defer principal payments for 5 years and make other concessions, in return for which the Commission made sure that the dollars that it was willing to accept went directly to them and nowhere else. And so what we created was something called a transition charge, which basically moved dollars from customers' wallets directly to the bondholders without stopping off at PREPA along the way. It's a long order that's been examined by the bond markets and has been accepted as representing the Commission's promise that bondholders will be paid. Our first view was stabilize the financial community's understanding of the seriousness of regulation before we try to get fancy, and that's the first action we took. Secondly, we approved an integrated resource plan after a proceeding that involved a great deal of changes by PREPA. What we did there, I'm not going to give you all the detail. We approved the permitting and maintenance and retirements of certain fossil units. We approved certain investments and budgets in transmission and distribution. We required a detailed audit of all contracts for renewable energy. We required that PREPA create a competitive bidding process for all future contracts. Did you all hear that? A competitive bidding process for all future contracts. Approval of certain energy efficiency resources, and various findings, many of them negative, about PREPA's lack of compliance with our orders. And we approved what's called a modified IRP. I want to stress why that's important in the context that we're discussing right now. The PROMESA legislation says that a project that is inconsistent with an IRP approved by the Commission cannot go forward, even if the FOMB wants it. And so that was Congress's way of establishing that the gateway to investment in Puerto Rico with respect to major energy projects is a gateway at which stands the Commission that, as I have discussed with you today, focuses on facts and logic, not incumbency, not political connections. So we thank the Congress for making clear the Commission's gateway authority. I'll talk more before we stop about how we hope to exercise that authority. The third thing that we did was we issued a rate decision. I want to say this as clearly as I can. The consulting team, if you go look us all up, you'll find out that none of us really has a history of being hired by the investor-owned utility industry. Apologies to Eric from EEI. We've been friends for years. But the fact is, you couldn't find a group of four more clearly associated with objective regulation and consumer protective regulation than the consulting team. And we wrote an order, which the Commission signed. They, of course, were part from the beginning, that granted nearly every single dollar that PREPA asked for in its rate case. This was not an easy decision for three commissioners to make, and it was not an easy recommendation for the consultants to make, but it was essential that PREPA get those dollars. Now, it wasn't a blank check. There's a whole series of conditions that I'll discuss momentarily, but I want you to know that the Commission is committed to the financial solvency of PREPA and was willing to take the political hits that would be associated with that position. So that was the rate decision. I want you to look, though, at number 3.3.3, budget review to protect customers from unreasonable cost. Understand that when you're setting rates for a nonprofit utility, if the utility spends imprudently, what are you going to do? You can't disallow the costs because it's nonprofit. They need the dollars to cover their expenses. If it was an investor-owned utility and there's imprudent costs, Eric knows this, anybody in the room knows this, the regulator disallows the costs from rates, the shareholders take the hit, they get mad at management, and the right people get in place and things improve, you hope. But when it's a nonprofit utility, the Commission doesn't have that kind of leverage. So what did we do in the rate case? It doesn't take a rocket scientist. We said, you get our approval of your budgets, you get your approval of our budgets before you spend the money. We won't micromanage, but we need to see the general parameters, we need to see the contracts, because once you spend the money, it's too late. So you get our budget approval first, you spend the money as you go, and that way we are doing the regulatory job of protecting customers from unreasonable cost. Guess who's appealing that order and that provision in particular in state court in Puerto Rico? PREPA. This is a company that received every dollar it asked for and didn't know how to say, thank you, we'll cooperate. That's one of the situations that we're dealing with right now that I want to make you understand. We have excellent lawyers handling it, And we think that the propositions that I set forth in Act 57 before give us the authority not to sit by and watch imprudent costs be incurred and then shrug our shoulders, but prevent them from being incurred ahead of time. Without that, I don't know where the regulatory leverage is. And so we will hope that the state court takes care of that, or we'll hope even further that the new leadership of PREPA withdraws that lawsuit. That's a conversation we hope to have in the coming days. I want to close, because I think I have about 2 minutes to go, with quickly describing some challenges that we have. Well, the first I just described, the difficulty of dealing with imprudent costs in a nonprofit context, which is especially difficult right now, given how quickly costs have to be incurred to get things up and running. The commission budgeting and hiring. Our commissioners, and I'm not going to get into Puerto Rico politics, I just got into Puerto Rico politics. I'm just going to be factual. The 3 commissioners originally appointed came from the prior administration. Our former chairman, Agustin Carbó, has retired. The 2 commissioners left, again, are not members of the party of the new administration. We have requests for budget. We have requests for hiring slots. We have all the normal requests that a commission needs in a normal situation, and they're not being acted upon, and that is somewhat difficult. We have received approval to do consulting contracts. We don't have approval for new hiring, and that's difficult and expensive. Next steps, very briefly. We need together to define the options in terms of resource mix, market structure mix, ownership mix. We have to define the criteria for choosing among the options. We have to think about static efficiency and dynamic efficiency, reliability, cost, customer choice. We have to get a grip on contracts. We can't have a situation where PREPA, citing an emergency, enters into a contract, whether it's a $300,000 public relations contract or whether it's a $300 million restructuring contract, without the commission having control over who gets it and how it's spent. Now, the commission is going to have to act quickly, but it cannot be left out of a situation where the public is understanding the risk of waste. We need to define a common view of the commission's role. We can't have FOMB saying that, not that they are saying it, saying that they will be in charge and there will be no regulation while the commission's issuing orders and not getting responses. I hope that's not going to happen. I think there is every reason to work out with FOMB their role and the commission's role, preserving the Commonwealth statute and also preserving the intent of Congress. And so that's the close of my comments. And I don't know if there's time left for questions, but I thank you very much for your being here and for caring about Puerto Rico.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. We appreciate your panel, and I would ask the other panelists to come up and take their seats, and I would ask Josen Rossi to return to introduce the panel. Of course, he's a panelist, so he can do that while he's taking his seat. Eric, you're going to introduce the panel.
All right. While our panelists are coming up, let me say at the beginning, I'm not with EEI anymore. I'm retired. I was for many years the Director of Alternative Regulation, which does give me a background in regulation. Speak into the microphone, thank you. But I want to be clear, I'm not representing EEI here today. If I make any comments during the course of our conversation, it's based on my experience in the industry, but I'm not speaking for EEI. And I also want to say, Scott, as somebody who comes from the industry, I'm very comfortable talking about the public interest. We relate to the public interest. We think we are servants. Utilities generally are servants of the public interest. So with that, let me begin, and we'll just go down the line. Tomas Torres is the executive director of ICSE. I have a relationship with ICSE. I've been working with Tomas most of the year. I'm sort of their Washington representative. Julia Hamm is the president and chief executive officer of the Smart Energy Alliance, a very forward-looking trade association that has fully embraced the challenges of grid modernization, which is what we want to get to talking about, I think. Dale Louda, is the executive director of the CHP Association. Combined heat and power is an important industry for the conversation about redevelopment in Puerto Rico. We have a lot of CHP on site already because we have industrial customers. As I am always reminded that Puerto Rico as an island system is different from other island economies in that it has had a very robust manufacturing base. Half of their GDP, I don't know what the GDP is right now, I heard they're flatlined, but recently half of their GDP was manufacturing. Most of our pharmaceutical manufacturers are in Puerto Rico, medical device. So they're different. And when we talk about redesigning the grid, we have to take that into account. Josen Rossi is the former, as we learned, former president of the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association. Tom Sanzillo, at the end, last but not least, is the Director of Finance for the Institute for Energy, Economics, and Financial Analysis, and has had an interesting career managing public finances. And so he has a lot of relevant experience also that we need to take advantage of. So with those introductions, my role as moderator is to watch the clock as we go through a set of prepared questions. And hopefully all of our panelists have seen these questions. I know I've discussed them with some. So I'm gonna read each question. They're designed to focus us on the issues and get us right to the heart of some of the challenges. And I will pose each question, and I will go down and let each panelist give them a few minutes to answer each question. And then we'll pause, and if there's a comment, if there's a rejoinder from the audience, or maybe a rejoinder from some other panelists, we'll take those. But my role is to watch the clock, so at a certain point I'll have to cut us off and we'll move on to the next question. So hopefully we'll have so much discussion that will be a challenge, and I invite you to participate. So the first question: can the old PREPA debt, the debt that was incurred, we've already heard a little bit discussion, the incumbent utility PREPA before the storms was technically insolvent. They had more debt on their balance sheet than they had assets value. So they really have no credit standing. They have no ability to raise new financing. And so the question is, can that pre-storm debt be effectively decoupled from the redesign of the new system? And so let me start with that. Tomas.
Yes. First of all, thank you and good morning, everybody. To be here is our honor for all you to take time to be here. Just to put it into context, it's $10 billion per the Federal Bankruptcy Court, a filing of PREPA in July 2nd, and yes, should be decoupled. And I will give you a brief explanation about that. It's a $10 billion debt, and the assets, pre-Maria, basically were estimated in $5 billion, capital assets. So debt to asset ratio is an outstanding 2 when you are supposed to be below 1 to be a solvent utility. So yes, that debt is on the way, should be removed, and in order to have the proper investment after the FEMA and the Engineer Corps restoration of the current system should be out of the way, so there can be a private investment. Now, very important, all need to happen, as Mr. Hempling said, within a very stringent regulatory framework.
Okay, thank you. Julia?
Yes, Julia Hamm, Smart Electric Power Alliance. Just to clarify, we actually are not a trade association. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, so we are not representing the interests of any one particular industry, but really looking to help everyone move through the transition that's happening in the electricity industry. So I think the only thing I would add to what Tomas has already said is that this is an opportunity to really think outside the box in terms of all options that could be on the table. And just one thought I had immediately was in terms of public-private partnerships. You know, what opportunities might exist that we can look at from other industries, other sectors that have done innovative things as we're looking, sort of putting the past behind us and looking forward, really using this as an opportunity to think creatively.
Dale.
CHP Association doesn't have a position on the debt restructuring, so I'll hold my time till next time and we can talk more about some of the solutions we have some thoughts about.
With regards to Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association and my personal opinion as well, two comments. I am personally I own Puerto Rico general obligation bonds. I am a bondholder involved in Puerto Rico debt. But on the other hand, I think President Trump is right on this point. The PREPA debt particularly needs to be wiped out. That doesn't mean that bondholders will be paid some after it's restructured, but it shouldn't be in the way of redesigning a new system and getting investors interested in Puerto Rico's opportunities to bring down cost. And again, I want to emphasize it. There's already in the approved IRP, Puerto Rico, 300 megawatts that are budgeted for CHP and distributed energy solutions industry. And there's budgeted renewable energy projects for more than that. And a lot of that can come out of just basic rulemaking to incentivize households, businesses, industry to invest now without waiting for a municipal debt resolution.
Okay, Tomas.
First, thank you all for coming. And what Scott described, for those of you who do policy work here or analysis, is the dockets that he was involved in putting together create a body of information about PREPA that allows us to really move forward. The organization was not prepared to do so before that. So they've already made a major public service, created a major public service and an asset that should be used going forward. And the other thing is he said that the four consultants were very committed to objective standards. Let me put it this way. I'm a former comptroller for the state of New York, and I have to look at professional hearings and all like that for most of my career to look at them. I would take out their adherence to objective standards and say that was the best team I've ever seen of professionals trying to put together a very broken system. You will not find any better than Scott. And so Puerto Rico is very lucky to have had that. On the debt issue, that's what I did. I managed a $300 billion municipal bond market for the state of New York. So as a technical matter, you can decouple this. And you could conceivably, if Puerto Rico was wealthier, you could simply say the $9 billion debt is simply going to be we're going to switch it over to some new corporation, and there'll be new revenues. Just pay for it, and we're going to redesign the system. That's not going to happen because that level of revenue doesn't exist on Puerto Rico. The entire island has financial problems and distress. So technically, you could do it. But I think Jose put it correctly. The debt is probably worthless right now, although you'll see various kinds of market mechanisms to prop it up through gimmicks and all kinds of other things. And so what do you do in that instance? Well, you declare the losses. That first method would be a very sloppy and improper way of handling debt. This is a proper way of handling debt. That's worthless. You have insurance companies that have been paid premiums over the years for a certain amount of the debt. They should be required to make good on the insurance payments so that the investors don't lose their money. It's not all of the $9 billion or $10 billion, but it's a considerable part of that. The underwriting teams, there is an audit that was prepared that looked at how the underwriting teams, this is the lawyers, the underwriters, the credit agencies, the accountants, the financial advisors, all of whom allowed and participated in PREPA moving their debt levels to extraordinary levels that we would characterize in the bond market as a reckless use of the bond issuances over time. They need to be brought to bear and pay their part of it. There's precedent for it. SEC does it on several occasions. I would give you more if you'd like. and where the studies are and whatever. The third area, because this level of borrowing was so profoundly wrong, there probably needs to instill confidence back in Puerto Rico and discipline in the bond market. There probably needs to be criminal prosecutions or at least investigations that go, it's too big, you know. PREPA could afford maybe, it's debatable, maybe 30% of what they currently owe. Somebody borrowed way too much for way too long, and there was a lot of problems in doing that. Then there needs to be something set up for compensation. The large investors, I think they just get their haircuts and they'll get reimbursed some here. They're going to lose. You don't lend money to people who can't pay it back because they won't. Pretty simple. But there have been people, small investors on Puerto Rico who live there and who don't have big hedges like some of the large global funds or hedges like the hedge funds have. They just simply lose their retirement. To those people, that's the fraud to me. That's the fraud. And there needs to be some way to compensate them. It's a separate set of transactions than what I was just saying, but that's the way to appropriately handle public debt that has failed so miserably.
Tom, I'm going to cut you off there. I sense
I'm done.
you know a lot about this. You could talk quite a bit longer about this.
I tried to do it
we'd
real
like
quick.
to. We'd like to need to mine that experience. Let me move on, though. We have another question. We get off the debt. How can we best fast track the revisioning for a new electrical system in Puerto Rico? The revisioning. As a step. And let me before I turn it over to Tomas, I think we all anticipate that there's going to be a two-step process to redevelopment of the electric grid in Puerto Rico. The first step is this emergency response that we're in right now. The federal government is rebuilding the legacy transmission system, but that's not the grid that we need in Puerto Rico. I think there's a pretty strong consensus. We need a new modern grid. And what is a modern grid? So that's the starting point for this fast-tracking the process. What is it? How do we? What are the new features that we need in the grid? And then how do we get there? So with that, how do we fast-track the visioning process?
Thank you, Eric. Well, like propelling discussions like we're having here with people that know Puerto Rico things, live in Puerto Rico, and want to propose some ideas to have a vision on how this should be. So let me have some facts. You mentioned about GDP. Puerto Rico GDP is fluctuated between 103, 105 billion. How doesn't it fit within the nation? Well, it's the number 37th GDP on the nation. And if you consider what is the manufacturing sector, which is half, actually it's about 48 billion, is number 18. So Puerto Rico's GDP manufacturing sector is number 18. So the vision of how to construct the system need to build around that. So how to build it? Well, there are industry, there are hospitals, there are big commercial centers. Those centers could produce their own energy. They can be renewable. They can have CHP. They can be the 51 state, as Julia is going to mention, I'm sure, just a few minutes ago. Well, we need to be resilient. Where I live, and I'm an engineer and a planner, we don't have any power, as right now about 80% at 5 weeks of the hurricane. And I need to stress this. I need to make a parenthesis. The mayor of San Juan, people are dying, statement is true. I have a personal loss in my family, but very close to me. And it's true, and many people had that. And so that needs to be addressed. And how to address that? Well, we can have Louda to encourage their partners to put CHP. We can have renewables. And need to be a resilient system. And again, well-regulated, and Mr. Hempling explained it, so we can all propel to a 21 smart system in Puerto Rico.
Okay, thank you.
So the question was how do we fast track this? And one of my favorite quotes is from a business authors. Sometimes we have to go slow in order to go fast. And I think this is a great example. So Tomas mentioned SEPA in the 51st state. So let me explain that a little bit. 3 years ago, we launched an initiative that had nothing to do with Puerto Rico. It had nothing to do with the District of Columbia, had nothing to do with this concept of statehood, but we called it the 51st State Initiative. And the initiative is focused on this idea of if you had a brand new 51st state that was a blank slate with no pre-existing electricity market design, rate structures, regulatory construct, compacts, how would people build the system in order to optimize the use of distributed energy resources together with all of the traditional resources that are available to us? So we've been running this initiative over the past 3 years, really bringing together thought leaders from across the electric power sector to talk about visions for what could be possible and roadmaps on how we get there. Now, unfortunately, we're sitting here today, while we did not design this initiative to be specific to Puerto Rico or anywhere else, seeing that Puerto Rico is about as close to this blank slate as we could possibly get in terms of the physical grid itself, in terms of the situation with the utility on the island, the fact that the regulatory body has only been in place for a couple of years, so there isn't decades of built up thought about this is how we do things, and therefore change is really hard. So Puerto Rico really is this amazing, unfortunate, but amazing example of this opportunity to start fresh and think about what could be possible. We believe that in order to do that, there needs to be a vision, but that vision needs to be created by the people in Puerto Rico. There are plenty of people in other places that have business interests in what happens there, but it should be the Puerto Ricans who come together through a very structured, thoughtful, facilitated stakeholder process that brings together all of the different interests on the island to talk about what the common vision is for the future of the island and its electric power. Once there's a common vision, then those stakeholders can talk about developing a roadmap on how you get from where we are today to fulfilling that vision. And it is going to take a long time to do that. We're talking about a multi-year process. But there needs to be a plan. That plan needs to be created by the people of Puerto Rico. So I think I'll stop there, but happy to talk more about that later.
Thank you. Dale.
Sunday will be 5 years since Hurricane Superstorm Sandy struck New York. Sunday is also supposed to be some severe storms in New York again. And it's an important anniversary because it's a great opportunity to highlight, in our case, for the CHP industry, one of the primary advantages that combined heat and power provides, which is keeping the lights on, keeping the products rolling out. And this happened in Superstorm Sandy. If you look at some of the photographs right after the storm of where the lights were on, pretty much where the lights were on, there was CHP. Where the lights weren't on, there wasn't CHP. Not 100%, but that's a pretty good guide. Similarly, in Puerto Rico, one of the main hospitals in San Juan was able to stay up and running, caring for patients, providing life-needed techniques because they had combined heat and power. What is combined heat and power? Still, probably most of you don't know what it is. It is a big machine, big or small machine that provides, just like it says, heat and power. The heat can also be cooled, so it's in one unit. You provide both the electricity and the heating and cooling. It's the newest old technology around. It's been around since Thomas Edison, but its time could be no more perfect than today. They come as small as this table to as big as this room. And they provide power in a variety of ways. The main ways I'll mention real quick is you could use combined heat and power unit along with an existing utility. That's something that happens in certain parts of the country now. It's an emerging use. The most common way you see combined heat and power, or often called cogeneration, used in the United States is to support a manufacturing facility. It also can support commercial facilities, as I mentioned, hospitals, hotels, things like this. Combined heat and power also is a crucial part of a smart grid, and that's what we're talking about here today, where along with solar and wind and other cleaner energy technologies, combined heat and power can provide the resilience and reliability that any grid needs, and used with these other technologies. And then finally, the fourth way is that CHP can be islanded, meaning it can, well, kind of an interesting time to use the term island in this island, but CHP can operate on its own. In other words, it doesn't need any wires, it doesn't need anything else at all. Just one CHP unit can provide the power and the heat and electricity that a facility needs. So it's a really cool technology, it's very exciting, and this opportunity in Puerto Rico is a great chance for us to help alleviate the current issues there. There's lots of oil coming into the country. The current grid hopefully will not be rebuilt because it clearly is fraught with difficulties. And we would like to help rebuild the grid in such a way that reflects some of these modern thoughts that we talked about earlier that frankly isn't necessarily even a grid as much as a new way to look at energy distribution.
Well, Mr. Lauro, I'm not looking for a job at CHP Association, but you should mention as well. We should mention that it can be the most efficient way of converting fuel to energy. It can approach 80% efficiencies when designed properly. The best central utility system, modern, when we finally modernize, will barely get up to 50% efficiency converting fuel to energy. So it's also the cleaner option.
Okay, thank you very much. Next.
Well, just a couple more comments. I have to agree that it's Puerto Rico stakeholders that need to take the lead, but we're going to need a lot of help, and we have to take into consideration bondholders, labor, and of course new investors, and the best way to do that transparently would be through Energy Commission proceedings. We also have to be cognizant that there are important obstacles to this happening transparently. I have my concerns regarding regulatory procedures being a little too slow. I don't know how that can be fixed in an environment where we have to move quickly and regain investor confidence as well as household confidence in Puerto Rico for people to stay in Puerto Rico and again invest in Puerto Rico. So I have my concerns regarding the regulatory processes, but it's the best way to ensure that redesign will consider everybody's interest, and that, as Mr. Hempling said, the final decision is based on facts and the best logic. Thirdly, it's I think our job, the ICSE's job, to convince FOMB, along with all of our investors and partners, U.S., that the best course of action is for them to follow the letter of the law promesa and work with the Energy Commission and negotiate just how quickly we can do this at the same time we use Puerto Rico legal power in addition to federal oversight in Puerto Rico.
Where Scott ended his commentary is, I think, where we are. There's sufficient body of information that doesn't require reworking. It's there. You just sort of build on it, and your next step is you have a sketch of an IRP that the commission has put forward. Now needs to be developed a little further, and then investment strategies moved upon so that the private sector can come in, see it, and begin bidding on it. You don't have to reinvent everything. This is not. I mean, the body of work that's been done is the basis upon which you can build the kind of grid system that we're talking about. You're not starting really from scratch. You're starting from many years of work by Tomas, Josen, the other groups who have put together the regulatory system, by the people of Puerto Rico who have done this already. It's there. We have to use it and strengthen it. The opposition to it is coming from inside PREPA, and I'm going to just do this. I don't care anymore. Anyway, and inside the governor's office, and this is about some kind of old status quo self-interests that are being protected, and just like the PROMESA board trying to change that, we need to change it within the electricity system as well.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on, I'm going to take this opportunity to make a comment myself in relation to this question. First, I'd say pick up on what two of you have said in terms of let's not reinvent the wheel. we have some interesting models in the lower 48. You talked about CHP, the importance of CHP. We have in the U.S. Utility industry, the investor-owned utility, this concept of the public purpose microgrid, which is a mini system. It could well be built with a CHP as an anchor system that is designed to provide resilience and high reliability to critical first responder type facilities, police, fire, hospitals, groceries, gasoline stations. That is a very interesting model that Puerto Rico might well look at and think about. Can we enhance existing CHP applications to build them into microgrids to integrate renewable energy with them and design them to support the grid? That would to me be a very interesting, fruitful thing. The other point I would make about this is that the visioning, I think you didn't use the word public collaborative, but I think that's what we're talking about. A public collaborative in Puerto Rico is a very important first step to build consensus among consumers in Puerto Rico of all kinds about what they want, what they need. But the visioning is just the first step. You know, based on experience in other utilities in the mainland, that in a way, that's the easiest part of it. The harder part is having a multi-year planning process that can efficiently, because the issue in part is how to build this grid at a price we can afford, at a rate trajectory we can live with. So how to manage the process, how to target investments where they're needed. So there's more to it than just envisioning. But I'll stop making a speech and move on.
You had a couple of people who had hands up.
You want to make a comment? Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Vadim Nicotine. I grew up in Puerto Rico. We own about 3 million square feet of real estate, so we know the pain of paying electrical bills for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
I agree with you wholeheartedly that PREPA is incompetent and the bondholder should not be paid a penny because they made the investment irresponsibly. That's my personal view, but one question that I have for you that in your opening remarks on this section, you talked about what do we do now to start rebuilding. FEMA is currently tasked and funded to start replacing the broken grid. Right. Per the Stafford Act, they have to rebuild exactly what was there. So unless we collectively ask for a waiver of that and ask them to start being intelligent about what they're rebuilding, we're just putting up a bunch of poles with a bunch of electrical wires that will fall the next time the wind blows. So I was a little bit surprised that no one addressed that. So could someone speak to that particular thing of our ability to redirect the billions of dollars that are coming to Puerto Rico in a more efficient way starting today?
I believe I can answer that. Let me see without going out of the boundaries of this forum, but FEMA do have what is called mitigation, and within mitigation they allow to correct what was deficiency built. So that can be addressed, and we had to have off-the-record conversation with people from FEMA, and that can be done and had been done on the past. I'm sure Tom, as former comptroller of New York, you can add to that. But yes, can be done, need to be done, and need to be decided and discussed. Right here we are in Congress. So that will be my take on your.
You had a second assignment. Anybody else want to comment on this?
But people need the poles up and the lines up as quickly as we can get them up.
Sure.
That's part of the solution, and I don't think FEMA right now is empowered legally to start the redesign, and they're not going to do the redesign, but there are portions of FEMA's legal powers that would allow hazard mitigation to bring in monies further than whatever PREPA is going to get from the insurance company.
So, and I would just add that, you know, the grid modernization is about adding new technologies and new functionalities to some kind of a legacy grid. So there will be a potential to make use of whatever FEMA restores on the way to a more modern grid. There may be an opportunity to just enhance what they do. So you had a question or a comment?
Thank you. Peter Baer with the Energy Wire, E&E News. 2 questions. What is the size of the federal contribution, the appropriation that's going to be required, in your view, to bring power back on in the short run and then to restructure the grid? What's the size of that federal capital investment, do you think? I have a second question.
Well, I believe I can take that. This is pre-Maria numbers because there is not a proper accountability of what will take to reconstruct the grid. But pre-Maria numbers, pre-hurricane numbers, per the proceeding of the Energy Commission for the IRP, the number for all the improvements required in generation, transmission, distribution was $5 billion. So it was pre-Maria. Now, post-Maria, with all the distribution that is on the floor and all the transmission grid, most probably that number has doubled or tripled.
And the second question is, should the commission oppose the Oversight Board's appointment of Noel Zamad as the overseer of the reconstruction of the grid? I've heard discussion about how you need to work with the Oversight Board on this, but should the commission go to court if it has to insist on its role in that process?
I would think the consensus opinion in the ICSE board would be no. They have the legal power to take charge of the PREPA mess, and the obligation now politically. Even yesterday, Tomas and I were having breakfast, and a tourist from Great Britain asked us about whitefish. So it's inevitable. I mean, the federal oversight is inevitable now politically, and it's necessary from the managerial standpoint because of incompetency, if not corruption, in PREPA, if that is your question. The question is who redesigns and how to best redesign. That's our real concern at this point.
Yeah, I mean, PROMESA is a fiscal body whose job it is to create a new fiscal balance within Puerto Rico, of which PREPA contributes. The Regulatory Commission is responsible for ensuring that that PREPA, or whatever its predecessor is going to be, run a well-run modern electrical system. So whomever is put into PREPA, the regulatory body still has to maintain those goals and objectives and standards over a period of time. So I don't think they would want to object. They might like the outside integration of PROMESA and PREPA to make it a little closer, so that PREPA becomes more accountable.
Could I comment as well? I think it's also probably the case that neither the Energy Commission nor the Financial Oversight Board really has the technical expertise involved in redesigning a modern grid. So at the end of the day, there is a question about how relevant expertise is going to be accessed and brought to bear. And that's why the notion of a public collaborative, that's part of the thing that a public collaborative might do. Once you get past the visioning process, you start to build some consensus on where you want to go. Part of the collaborative also is to talk about, well, what do you need? What kind of resources? There are new planning paradigms, new planning methods, new kind of data that is really all part of this grid modernization process. How are we going to get that? And what are some of the sources of expertise in the electric utility world, in the CHP industry, in SEPA, in other places that we can access and bring to bear? So to me, that's part of the strategy for doing this. So with that, thank you. I think it's a good conversation. Let's move on. This next question is sort of a management question. What parameters need to be considered in redesigning the electric system? And particularly, what are some key economic parameters? And what are some key government performance parameters?
Okay. First of all, and a follow-up to the second question as well. Puerto Rico has, I believe, the greatest nuclear reactor is the sun. Yes, it is the sun, and we got it for free. And we got 5 hours per day of solid radiation almost every single day. We have a renewable portfolio standard, talking about parameters, that of 12% by 2015. You know, Eric, how much we are?
About 4%? Yeah.
12%. We were supposed to be 12% renewable. So let me explain a little bit. Of our total generation, that is 16,300 millions of kilowatt hour, 15% of that was supposed to be renewable 2 years ago. You know how much it is now?
A couple of percent.
Barely 2.
Barely 2.
So that is a metric that we need to push forward, because in 3 years from now, we're supposed to be 15. And we really need to move forward, because we are in the Caribbean. We have the greatest nuclear reactor for free. So we need to use it. So now, having talked about that, there is a great social distress in Puerto Rico due to the current things and current centers of Puerto Rico, hospitals, universities in Puerto Rico that group almost 100,000 people daily. Can you imagine 100,000 people getting a hot meal, having in a climate-controlled environment? That would stabilize the situation. That is not happening. Hospitals, they have the generators, but they don't have power from the grid yet, neither from a good CHP that was not in place before. So commercial centers. I had been in Plaza Las Americas, and then Plaza Las Americas need to be evacuated immediately because power went up, as well as the financial and the, not the financial, the industrial parks. Most of them don't have power. That needs to be fixed, and having that to happen 5 weeks on last Wednesday of the hurricane is not acceptable, and all efforts need to be done to fix that. Now, talking about parameters. The parameters of PREPA, typical PREPA, that very well Mr. Vigitin said, was in very distress, but the major distress of PREPA was its management, and that needs to be fixed. And let me explain a little bit. What is called the ICSE, which is the average for the frequency of power when power goes out a year. And normally in the U.S. is 1 a year. In Puerto Rico, prior to Maria, was 12. So that culture of mañana, right? The culture of fixed mañana need to be fixed. And we are a U.S. soil, so we need to have a SAIFI of 1, and that should be our goal. The SAIDI, which is the number of hours that the system is.
Can I
yes,
translate?
go ahead.
SAIDI. We're talking about SAIDI here.
SAIDI.
System Average Interruption Duration Index.
There you go. Which is the number of hours that you are without power a year. Normally, in any U.S. Jurisdiction, the average for a PPA is 1 hour. In Puerto Rico, is 18. So our culture needs to be changed to be 1. That should be our target. And for last, the CAIDI. Did I mention that? CAIDI. All right. So it's about 60 minutes to 70 minutes. In Puerto Rico, we got 3 hours. So that is the time when the power goes out, the time to restore in every single outage. So we need to change the mindset. We need to send the mindset of the management of our administrator of the electrical system. So we are set into national standards.
Okay. Let's move on. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll talk about this related to the 51st State Initiative that SEPA has been running. And again, experts across from electric utilities, regulators, both federal and state, technology, entrepreneurs, all perspectives experts from across all perspectives have been involved in this initiative. And over the 3 years, we've been taking a look at what are some of the commonalities in terms of parameters where everyone agrees these are the parameters we need to be designing around. And there are really 4 very high-level parameters that we've identified that everyone can agree with. The first is around market efficiency. So there are lots of pieces to that, but market efficiency partially is about energy efficiency. And obviously we're here talking about rebuilding the grid in Puerto Rico, but there are a lot of physical buildings that also need to be rebuilt. So how does energy efficiency play into that? As we begin to rebuild the grid itself, how do we think about system efficiency? And that's where a lot of the new grid modernization technologies come into the conversation. So one parameter really is around thinking about redesigning for market efficiency. The second parameter is around really clearly defining roles and responsibilities. And that obviously is also a conversation that's been happening over the past few years in Puerto Rico. But what is the appropriate role for the utility going forward? Is it the same as what it's always been? Should it change in some way? What role should third parties have? And really making sure, again, through a stakeholder process, there is a transparent and clear agreement around what is best for Puerto Rico in terms of the roles of the different players, including the utility. The third parameter would be around rate structures and thinking about, as we go through this rebuild, what should the rate structures look like going forward? How do we make sure that retail rates are controlled and affordable for customers, but it's done in a way in which there is financial sustainability for the utility, as that's going to be necessary because someone is going to need to maintain the system and have the revenue to be able to do that. So we could spend hours just talking about rate design issues. So I'll leave it at that for now. But then the fourth parameter would be around customers and customer choice and thinking about what is it that Puerto Rican customers want. And both residential customers, the commercial and industrial customers, not every customer wants the same thing. So how do you provide choice for those customers? And not necessarily, I'm not talking specifically about choice of retail electricity provider, but choice in terms of it may be from the utility, choices in terms of different program options, choices in terms of different rate structures. But having simplicity is important, but giving customers the ability to have more choice in their electricity as technology enables to do that. So I'd lay out those 4 high-level parameters.
There are lots of parameters, obviously. Dale.
I think if you're developing any new electrical system, 3 of the top things you would look for are reliability, resilience, and flexibility. So what's reliability? Obviously, we touched about a little bit earlier. It's not as reliable in Puerto Rico that it might be on the mainland, so that the system needs to be reliable so that you can depend on it. Resilience is just basically the strength, so that the system needs to be able to withstand storms, withstand perhaps extreme heating events. It's not just a hurricane that comes through. To be able to withstand any disaster that could befall it, so it's resilient and strong. And it needs to be flexible. One of the difficulties with the current system is it's not flexible. So when the one part of it goes down, the whole system goes down. As battery technologies change, as solar technologies change, wind technologies, there will be more opportunities for rebalancing the electric grid. And the flexibility will be important. That's why some of these microgrids are particularly good, because they're not from just one centralized power station. There might be a variety of different sources across the island that can be used at the appropriate time. Of course, the most important part we take for granted here is that reliability and resilience angle, though. I mean, if you've got to have the critical infrastructure, hospitals, prisons, the key infrastructure. If you have a loved one that's going in for surgery, obviously you need that power cannot go off for even a fraction of a second. But those are easy to figure out. We also have to remember that even the food supply, a lot of these food supplies, if you lose the power just for a short amount of time, even just for a very short amount of time, that the entire product could be wasted. So that ability to have reliable and resilient and flexible power structure, I think, is the basis for the future development of the system.
Good, thank you. Josen.
Yep. Pre-Maria, these were the parameters that the fiscal board ordered that PREPA couldn't comply with, and thus the PREPA fiscal plan went the bankruptcy way, went federal bankruptcy. They said in 5 years, target rate average 21 cents a kilowatt hour. Base energy costs for Puerto Rico and their households and businesses averaged out. And they also said that we got to get, including a 23% demand drop in PREPA consumption. Okay, so what should we change with that, and what should we add? I agree that with the comments here, colleagues, that process is key in the redesign. If we're going to get it right, and a public collaborative with parameters as SEPA is proposing, I think is very important. Target rate, PRMA now says we want to get the economy back up and get investors' confidence, whether households or business. We're going to have to get lower than 20 cents a kilowatt hour households, lower than 15 cents a kilowatt hour businesses, particularly industry. Regarding PREPA demand drop, I believe that you have to add one more parameter here after Maria, and that is what is the cost to households and businesses of not having energy security after a Class 5 storm. This was only a Class 4 storm. There are Class 5 storms, and they can go from east to west in islands the size of Puerto Rico. So I believe FEMA has some numbers that they will have to be doing with that, but I think the collaborative will have to include what is the cost of not having energy security, and that will end up meaning that PREPA demand drop will probably be more like 50% in order to save Puerto Rico, not only from the next storm, but from PREPA itself, and achieve the target rates that I'm talking about. Lastly, this is not necessarily a parameter, but it's key in the early on process. Immediate cost segregation of generation, distribution, and the core commercial activities of PREPA. PREPA does have a lot of non-core activities that can be just, ditched. But the rest that is key going forward, so that the grid, the other 50% that will not be demand drop, it works, is to segregate the cost immediately and find marginal costs as you create market structures.
Josen, that's called cost unbundling in the utility vernacular. Tom?
Yeah, I agree with just about everything everyone has said. I would add that you're also going to be looking at a new way in which money is invested in the electricity grid. And so the normal way that we would look at this is, the utility comes in, they have their new power plant or their retrofits or their transmission costs, and they're calculated into the system, and out pops a rate, and that's really, that's a quick way and overly flippant. But anyway, what we're going to see here is tens of thousands of homeowners making private investments against their credit lines and their mortgages in order to upgrade their homes. There will be tax expenditures, probably out of the federal tax code, that help to support that kind of activity. That's all investment, and as a homeowner who has put solar energy in there, nobody counts my blood, sweat, and tears, and I wish they would, because that is what in the old-fashioned housing sector, it was called sweat equity, and every homeowner does it, and it counts for something. It's the investment in the home, in the community, and in Puerto Rico, and you're going to see this. And so the way in which loans are done, loan guarantees, is all very different. We've designed a few programs in New York State around this, and you have to count capital into the system, and particularly when it comes to commercial properties as well. It's a completely different way of doing it. It's not utility-based financing. It's customer-based financing. And it's going to be a major part of the kilowatt hours, and it'll be a major part of the capital investment. And it is the positive story of how this is going to turn around.
Eric, can I build on that?
Please.
So I'd just like to point to the Sacramento Municipal Utility District as one municipal utility that is really doing a great job in exactly what you're talking about. They are thinking very proactively about the investments their customers are making in distributed energy and understanding what that means in terms of what they, as the utility, what investments do they need to make in order to maintain and upgrade the distribution system. So I just point to them if anyone's interested in more information. We've done a lot of work analyzing what they're working on and how they're thinking about things, and I think it's a great example. They're sort of on the leading edge of that type of thinking.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on. I want to save a little time at the end. We're supposed to be over at 1:25, so I have two more questions I want to go through, but then I'd like to open it up. So please, I hope you have some questions you'd like to pose or comments you'd like to make. So a fourth question has to do with structure, system structure, utility structure. What system structure and PREPA restructuring must be considered, both short-term and long-term?
Like Housing Rossi said a few minutes ago, the system needs to be back in line as soon as possible to save life and restore the economy. Now, having said that, what the future system should look like? Well, let me give you some numbers. Puerto Rico transmission lines is about 2,000 millions of miles. And sorry, the million was not right. It's 2,000 miles of transmission lines. And on distribution lines is 35,000 miles. That's the number. 2,000 miles of transmission and 35,000 miles of distribution. What that points? Well, that points that Puerto Rico is a typical DSO. It is a distribution system operator. So we need to target to that based with distributed energy resources, based on solar, based on all these things that will make the system resilient, like battery storage, storage and so on, and counting also with energy efficiency and demand response programs. The Puerto Rico system needs to be viewed not as a transmission and distribution system, but as a DSO that can be subdivided in several regions and can be operated maybe and franchised to different operators. And thinking into the future, I believe, and I will have just a dream here, I would like that 10 years from now, I will have 2 or 3 operators that I can call and get offers if I want a 6-month package of $100 or if I want a per hour payment of whatever I pay per hour. And that should be the future. The future should be toward that, toward distribution system operators, toward the restructuring of markets at distribution retail level. How do I fix that in order to make a modern system that is operatable? Now, very important, that needs to happen under a strong regulatory framework. That cannot be a one-man show. Because if it's a one-man show, there can be some other white fishes that we don't want to see around.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I'm going to pass on the question.
Okay. Dale?
I just want to comment and support what you talked about earlier about, forget the way you said, community-based or bottom-up. I mean, I think that's one of the main things when this is designed, that it not be designed from some headquarters somewhere where we say, what's best for the entire island? Because maybe these microgrids, maybe they would be a more appropriate resource. I don't know enough about that, but somebody in Puerto Rico does know. So it's particularly essential that this be community-based design so that the system really serves the people of Puerto Rico in a way that's appropriate for that place.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. It does. We've heard a lot of people say, for example, the whole island should be a series of microgrids, and that might be a great long-term vision, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing right away. You said it earlier.
That's right.
There might be
Right.
certain critical facilities where you do want microgrids immediately, right? But I like your point about the island is diverse, so it may not even, it may be different parts of the islands have different solutions that are best fit for that part of the island.
I would hope that in the public collaborative and the fiscal board and the energy commission, there's going to be high-level thinking and take advantage of it's almost a clean slate redesign opportunity, unlike any I would think that's in the books of regulatory or FEMA redesign. So I would hope that we have a thinking that includes wild ideas like Puerto Rico's grid is really an outcome of early industrialization. Puerto Rico petrochemicals in the South Coast, and not many urban centers like we have today, and that means probably transmission and distribution lines that are still up in the air in the future should be in different locations than they are now, and that the easy solution that bury the lines probably means all urban centers. But I think that the high-level thinking should include a total rethink of where the transmission and distribution and how it should strengthen the telecom infrastructure that everybody was surprised was destroyed. I wasn't surprised electricity, but telecom disappeared for a few days after the storm, causing tremendous first response logistical and anyhow, telecom or digitizing the grid in the future would be key to market creation and getting the consumer to be an actor. So we have to think about telecom, digitized grid security as well.
Tom.
You asked a management question, which is, to me, how you get from here to there. You start with a clear-eyed view of what we have. What we have here is a mismanaged system that's corrupt and corrosive, and it's endemic. That's what you have, right? So organizational forms exist to correct these kinds of situations. One of them is called an independent private sector inspector general. The job of the independent private sector inspector general is to come in, help with management efficiencies, help to plan the organization going forward, weeds out corruption, and imposes a code of ethics. The basic theory is good business is good ethics. I was appointed to run the racetracks in the state of New York after a massive corruption scandal that was endemic. Even the stalls that had to be mocked every day the system of management there was corrupt. And it was if you can conceive of that, I would describe it if you were interested later. But every single aspect, the parking lot attendants had a system that was corrupt. I mean, you had to go down every single aspect. And listening to the hearings and the hearing stuff that Scott and his team put together, that was reminiscent to me because there are great workers there, and they're being suppressed by really bad management over the years. And when you can lift that boot off their throats, you'll get a much better workforce and a much better appreciation of it. And you can begin a planning process that's honest.
Okay. Let me ask, though. You've ducked. Now, our panelists who are not from Puerto Rico, it's understandable. They don't know enough. But our Puerto Rican experts, you have ducked the question about PREPA restructuring. What do you think should happen to PREPA? Should it be restructured? Should it be privatized? Should it be Tom, how would you?
I think this is to me. You're asking a method before you have a purpose, right? The kind of plans that people have talked about are plans that we need to settle on, sort of more precise investment strategies for the type of grid you want, and that will because the way the markets work, they will tell you what kind of an organizational form that those services and new ways of delivering services must be organized. And then how government wants to regulate that, that's what Scott and his team are for. And they'll come up with something that's different. It could be one umbrella company or entity that sort of helps to coordinate various things. It could be 3 or 4. I don't know that I could tell you exactly how to do that right now, but I can tell you that the corporate forms exist. And the trick will be in a new regulatory system.
We have one more question, then I'll open it up, and we'll start with you. I know you want to make a comment. But can I get my last question, get it out of the way? So the last question is there a key policy or legal change that must be enacted by Congress and locally to enable truly once-and-done redesign and implementation? What do you think about that?
Well, actually, yesterday we were talking to some friends, and we were talking of the importance of strengthening the regulatory framework in Puerto Rico. And we mentioned to them that in Title V of PROMESA, if you want to do the emergency infrastructure projects that are listed in that same Title V, in regards to energy, because Title V applies to all sorts of emergency projects. It's applied to water, it's applied to transportation, and to energy as well. But in regards to energy and in regards to land use, if you need to propose a project and they need to be included in the integrated resources plan, what is related to energy. And if it's not included on the integrated resources plan, the commission has 60 days to review it. And if it's a negative from the commission, the project will no go. And that is included actually right now in Title V of PROMESA. So what needs to be done? Well, that needs to be take a little step further. So the commission, like we say earlier, is under the shadow that either this week or next month will be the last day in office, because there is not a clear policy from the court administration regarding the independent regulator. That needs to be on a step further to give confidence to the commission that they can start the public collaborative, that they can start the transformation, the transformation path to the future, and they will be supported by the current government, state, and federal. So that
you're
is very
suggesting
important.
they need explicit statutory authority to do this kind of a process?
Absolutely, and that is addressed in Title V of PROMESA.
Okay, thank you. Julia, comment?
So we don't propose policies, we don't take positions on policies. So I think what I'll respond to is really the premise of the question. I don't think there is a once and done, right? I mean, this industry is changing so quickly, and I think that's important that everybody who is involved in this process has that mindset going in, that this is going to be an ongoing, whatever is designed has to be flexible, right? From a policy standpoint, technology standpoint, all of it, we've got to build in flexibility to be able to continue to evolve it. So whatever policies are enacted, that needs to be front of mind.
Okay, thank you. Dale?
Well, there's a real dilemma here, and that is that beyond all these great ideas and proposals, and I was not aware of the Stafford Act, but there's clearly the FEMA and Army Corps are underway getting things rebuilt. So it's sort of genuinely ironic that as we're rebuilding Puerto Rico's system exactly the same way it was, we're also talking about rebuilding it in a new way. But once it gets done, it's going to get done in March or April or something. We're not going to tear the whole thing out in July and start all over again. So the timing in some ways is just horrible. It's just, I mean, obviously there's other tragedies they're facing, but like, who's going to want to redo the entire system the month after we rebuild the whole system?
Well, and I think the answer is we're not going to rebuild the whole system.
Right. Well, but
the
there'll be
issue
changes
is
made
how
to
are we
it,
going to
yeah.
adapt it over time?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But it undercuts that. We keep talking about this is a great opportunity to put
Get
a whole new
public
system
input,
in
yeah,
place.
yeah.
But really, we're not going to be able to put a new system in place for right now.
What did Scott say about imperfect markets and imperfect regulation? Maybe this is an example, but Josen, one of
I don't think it's going to get put back in place in a perfect fashion. It's getting put back in place quickly and thus imperfectly. And I think we still have to learn more about how FEMA will recognize the cost of energy security in the future and hazard mitigation. So I think there's going to be an opportunity to fix important things going forward. But regarding the question, I would go back to structure and once and done comment. I think there's some mileposts you can ask everybody to agree on, including Congress, which is really in charge of Puerto Rico. That's the territorial clause of Congress and its territories. Whether they like it or not, they're in charge. Normally they don't like it, and now it's obvious that they're in charge, right? So we got to make the best of that, and they do want once and done. Okay, they're thinking in that fashion. After our 2 days here, at talking to leadership and staff leadership here, and I think they would very much enjoy having an independent professional body that regulates the further once and dones, so that the fiscal board and them can step away from the evolving improvement of the grid in the future. And I think that can be done in 5 years. And I think we can encourage Congress to make sure that the staff and the leadership of the Energy Commission is as integral a part of the whatever new legislation is written, so that we have that clearly defined milepost where the system is back up, redesigned as best possible, and being regulated efficiently to the future, and then the fiscal board and Congress can step out of that.
Okay. Tom, a final comment? Answer.
The New York City Control Board is in its 42nd year. Anyway, what I would do currently is I would increase the size of PROMESA's budget and cause a pass-through to the Regulatory Commission to maybe triple the size of their budget, and probably make PREPA have some capability of planning so that they can respond and participate in this process that Congress would like to see them deal with. I know some of the legislators in Puerto Rico would like to see them deal with it, and that the businesses would like to see them deal with. So I think they need to be a bit more accountable, and whatever mechanism, I think money does a lot of that, could do a lot of that.
Okay, at this point, we're going to open it up. If you have a comment or question, please raise your hand. I will take you one at a time. We have a first participant here. Please identify yourself.
And I will. And we have 3 minutes for questions?
I think we're going to go till 12. Can we go to 1:30? Yeah, 1:30.
Okay, great, because I don't want to take time for others as well. So my name's H.T. Chazelle. I run a stakeholder engagement platform across 4 cities in the U.S., each city focused on energy transformation. So these are the core stakeholders of each city that have committed to achieving the 80 by 50 goals. And so I do a lot of stakeholder engagement work. And what I have as a concern that gets stronger and stronger in these discussions is the fact that we started this session with an acknowledgement this is an emergency. And then from this being an emergency, we've gotten into discussions around policy, PROMESA, PREPA, et cetera. But if we don't always come back to the fact that this is an emergency now, we lose the ability to have our sense of urgency to this issue. And it's actually about stakeholder engagement right now. And the framework is something, as leaders in this room, we create today. The fact that you have the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA doing things that we're concerned is creating poor infrastructure for the future, that's a big problem. And the fact that we don't have that being addressed in a stakeholder forum, someplace, somewhere happening, that we can bring our collective intelligence to that discussion, means that we're missing the boat. We gotta get on that. And so that's a comment I have for the group, is how do we anchor these discussions in action and in constructive results, that when you say the comments that you do, that they move something forward. Because people are suffering right now. That's my comment.
Anyone else? Any of our panelists would like to respond to this observation?
It was hard getting flights out of Puerto Rico, too many people leaving at the same time. This was the best we could do up to now. If you are there and you try and check who's in charge, FEMA, Corps of Engineer, Government of Puerto Rico, PREPA, it's also difficult to find who's the leader right now. Thus, whitefish plus that fact means PROMESA board is moving to try and fix the PREPA thing. But your comment, that hasn't been fixed yet. So the best we can do, private sector, is to try and push forward the collaborative, even if it hasn't been ordered by the governor or ordered by Congress yet.
I think Scott would like to comment, and then we'll come to you. Right? You want to go? Okay. Identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Shannon McLaughlin, and I'm the Community Planning and Capacity Building Coordinator for FEMA Region 2, which includes New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. We should note that there is a set of mechanisms in place right now and a federal coordinating officer who is running operations in the field. We also have a standard role that thinks about long-term recovery issues. That is the Federal Disaster Recovery Coordinators. I have one of them next to me right now, Earl Zulke, who is the FDRC from Region 5. He's just returned from Puerto Rico, as has our other FDRC, and we are trying to convene stakeholders here as we are establishing the groups that are the mechanism whereby these conversations happen, and those are called the recovery support functions. In theory, the Army Corps is the coordinating agency for the infrastructure systems recovery support function. As of right now, we do not have that person named who will be leading the recovery support function for infrastructure systems for Puerto Rico. But my colleague behind me, Luis Bernal from USDA Rural Development Energy Division, has been a huge help in those meetings, and we invite others to be part of that. For Julia, I'd love you to be part of my recovery support function is not infrastructure systems, it's community planning, capacity building. And we'd love to have more conversations and invite you to those meetings. So unfortunately, right now, those meetings are happening in Washington, D.C., and they should be happening in Puerto Rico and in the USVI. More pressure needs to get out there to make that happen. We understand why it has happened this way. The current federal coordinating officer is like, there is too much at stake for me to think that any side conversations are happening with the emergency support functions. We don't want the recovery support functions taking away the attention from life-saving and life safety. We totally get it, but we are capable of going in and not taking away energy from them. And by not having us there, it's true, there is a disconnect. They are rebuilding, they're rebuilding up to code anyway. They're not just rebuilding to pre-storm. But it's not true that the Stafford Act only allows us to rebuild to pre-storm conditions or to code. The people who are telling you that, though, include the emergency support functions and the people in the field who misunderstand the law there. So it's not a big law, it's not a long law. Read it, the Stafford Act, Section 406, mitigation. It's there, we can do it, and we can do it with disaster money. Let alone, part of the conversation is there's a lot of things besides disaster money that are going to be available. Yeah. So the conversation, there is a place. We have to work to make that system work better. Every time there's a big disaster, we throw out what we've already established and we put in something different. Instead, this time, let's try to make the system that we've said work, that we've established for it, and let's give the authority and the power to the groups that are supposed to be helping make it happen. And we'd love to invite you all to be part of that. And
Eric, let me comment on this first two comments. First, I applaud you. And let's give her applause. It's a great comment.
And thank you for coming and being here to educate all of us.
And HK, your question, that is the response. This kind of forum is the beginning. It was great to hear you. And so we need to put the proper path. And the proper path is a public collaborative. So we look forward to the Puerto Rico Energy Commission to start that as soon as possible, because we all will be supporting the Puerto Rico Energy Commission in that public collaborative, because that is needed now, and we'll have the support of all the private sector, and as I can see, even as per FEMA's in certain extent. So great, and this is the first step, and we expect that this is a tide that start growing till we get the restructuring of Puerto Rico electrical system done.
I will be asking for your business cards after the meeting. I will be looking for an opportunity to sit down and have discussions and get your input to come up with these longer-term solutions. Sir, you commented about this is an emergency. It still is an emergency, and it's kind of hard to sit and discuss long-term solutions that may take years and years and years. When your house is destroyed, you've got no power. So it is kind of a dichotomy that, we're in a dilemma. We need to get immediate actions to help give people basic life services, but we also need to have the discussions that are taking place to come up with long-term solutions that will benefit the territory of Puerto Rico.
Thank you very much. This may be the most constructive part of our summit here. Scott wants to get in here.
Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to start the conversation and to represent the Commission. A few things I want to mention. Any day now, it may be any hour now, I didn't want to be rude and check my messages. The Commission will issue an order that describes a broad investigation that focuses on the short and the medium and the long term, that will invite everybody to submit questions that ought to define the scope of the case. We're not going to define the scope of the case sitting in our 7th floor office. We've got ideas, but we want to make sure that every question that everybody has is on our list so we can come up with a chronology and a sequence and a clear organization for doing that. I hope you will respond to the request for questions. Now, that word stakeholder, you know, when I first got started in the business, the word we used to use was interest groups. But I guess people decided that was too blunt. So now the word is stakeholders. From a regulator's standpoint, the issue is not positions, it's perspectives. We know people want to make money. We know people want to get their houses up and running. We know people want economic development. Those are positions. The perspectives that we're looking for are, what does it mean to run a cement company with power that costs 26 cents? What does it mean to try to start a small business with power that costs such and such? What does it mean when you're trying to run a school and the SAIDI is X instead of Y? It's the perspectives that we're looking for. So there are groups that will want to talk about what they can have for dinner. There will be we don't call it a collaborative, we call it a regulatory proceeding in which we're deciding what is the cost-effective solution to the problem that we define in the short, medium, and long term. So I want to thank again the opportunity. The other point, very quickly, I don't know if somebody misspoke. Act 57, the 2014 Act, gives the Commission all the authority it needs to put into effect whatever everybody determines with Commission review is the right answer. The only question in our mind right now is whether there's uncertainty on the part of some lawyers, not the lawyers of the Commission, about whether the PROMESA Act in any way preempts the Commission's authority. It's the Commission's position that there was no preemptive power in the PROMESA Act. The FOMB right now thinks that our budget review requirement that I mentioned in my conversation is somehow inconsistent with their budget review authority. That is easy to work out if a conversation can occur. So if you're interested in a strong commission, you're interested in avoiding preemption, misunderstandings of the PROMESA Act that would preempt the Commission's powers. Again, I want to thank the organizations, and Eric, thank you for your excellent work.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you want to say a few closing words? Yes, I think we're ready. Oh, yeah. He wants me to remind you that we will have an opportunity for the press to ask questions after we conclude the formal forum. So if you want to listen to those questions and answers, stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Has this been a good discussion?
Yes.
And this is a discussion we need to continue. And I particularly want to thank our panelists, everyone in attendance, for participating in today's discussion. It's certainly, from my view, been a very interesting discussion about the future of Puerto Rico and getting the lights back on and doing it the right way. So I particularly want to thank, again, our sponsors, the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association, the Institute for Competitiveness and Sustainable Economy, the Center for the New Economy, Institute for Efficient Economics and Analysis, the Smart Electric Power Alliance, pardon me, I write like a doctor sometimes, and the Combined Heat and Power Association for their leadership in helping sponsor and participate in today's forum. We will, on the websites, have available copies of this forum, which have been videotaped as well as being broadcast live on Facebook Live. So we'll communicate with you so you can obtain that link if you'd like to review. Please continue this dialogue, and as was mentioned, for members of the news media, the panelists and others are available for discussion following this meeting. Thanks again. Our carriage turns into a pumpkin at 2 o'clock, so we must bring this discussion to an end. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend.